Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not therapy or medical advice and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Karla Sanchez. Karla is a licensed clinical social worker and a trauma-informed yoga teacher who blends cognitive behavioral therapy with mindfulness, self-compassion, and yoga to help her clients. So, Karla, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for
Thank you
having me.
of course. Thank you for agreeing to be my guest and to do this with me. And just so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I'm a licensed therapist. I've been a therapist for about 13 years now. And I also have a background, like you mentioned, as a trauma-informed yoga instructor that I blend in with my therapy. But I'm a social worker at heart. And what I really focus on working with people is to help them manage their anxiety, help them overcome like fearful thoughts and that hustle culture of just doing, so that they can learn to have a little bit better relationship with themselves and their mind and their body, and just feel a little bit calmer. So that's kind of the gist of what I do. Outside of that, I'm originally from Long Beach, but now I'm living in Santa Cruz. I have 3 pets, and I like spending time in nature. And yeah, that's a little nutshell of me. I hope that
Nice. I
answered that.
appreciate that. No, of course, of course. It's funny because as we were talking before we started recording, you mentioned that you were nervous. And I'm thinking to myself, how is she nervous? Like, she's a therapist. I'm the one who's nervous, right? So we said we would have a little moment to talk about both of us being nervous and that it's still a thing, no matter, what your title is or how many times you've done this or what have you. So I appreciated you being honest about how you were feeling because I think it's relatable.
Yes. I haven't hacked the emotions yet, but I think a big part of what I do is also saying like, no matter what we do, we find tools to cope with our anxiety or feelings, but you're still gonna have them. It's part of the human experience to feel nervous, unless you're like really staying in your comfort zone and 100% of the time, you're gonna feel nervous. You're gonna feel anxious. It's part of life. It's a normal emotion. So I'm glad that we were able to talk about it and that we're both feeling it because it makes it feel a little less stressful.
Right, of course. So we can both be comfortable. And also, if you're in your comfort zone all the time, there's no growth that happens there. So you got to challenge yourself a little
Exactly.
bit. All
Exactly. If we
right.
can embrace the discomfort, then we can grow, like you mentioned. If we're not, then we're avoiding, then we're staying stuck in these old patterns and cycles, which, to each their own, but I think I like the idea of growth personally.
Yeah, me too. All right. So you ready to get into
I'll talk a little bit
the
more
heart of
about
it?
right. I'm sorry?
I said, you ready to
Yes,
get into the
let's
heart of
dive
it?
right in.
Okay, cool.
Let's
So,
do it.
what is cognitive behavioral therapy?
All right. So, cognitive behavioral therapy, I think a lot of people have heard about it, but I want to little unpack it, and if you will. And it's really based on this connection between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior. So it's like what we call it a cognitive triangle, if you will. And basically saying the way we feel is largely influenced by how we're thinking and what we're believing, so the stories we're telling ourselves. And it's also influenced by how we behave. So, for instance, we talked a little bit about how I was feeling nervous, right? I want to use that as an example to illustrate this like CBT, like this little cognitive triangle. Um, so some of the thoughts that it might lead to me feeling anxious whenever I do any kind of public speaking are like, I'm going to mess up. I'm going to come across as, I'm going to say something dumb. I'm going to be perceived negatively by other people. They're going to judge me. They're going to think I don't know what I'm talking about. Those type of thoughts, right? Um, or or I'm just going to look so nervous that it's going to like, I don't know. I can go on and on. Or maybe I have a core belief that I'm unlikable and people are going to pick up on that. You know? So these are like these stories that are coming in my mind that are creating this feeling of anxiety, if that makes sense.
I
You raised
feel.
your hand, like, can you relate to that? Yeah. Yeah. So with CBT, that would be like the cognitive piece, right? The beliefs and the stories that I tell myself that cause this discomfort I'm feeling in my body. Whereas the behavioral part, is about what we do. So if I'm feeling so anxious about like public speaking, I might just never do it, right? I might cancel this meeting, or I might just never put myself out there. And so part of working on things through a cognitive behavioral lens is like really examining those stories that we're telling ourselves, trying to think of more helpful ways of thinking. So I might remind myself of the last time I did something like this, and like, okay, it didn't go as bad as I thought it did. It actually went pretty well. And or I might tell myself like, hey, it's normal to feel anxious. Everybody feels anxious when they do these type of things, and that's okay, and it's temporary. Or I might even like remind myself like, it's brave that you're doing something that makes you anxious, and you're gonna get better at it the more you do it, right? So these are like, I'm changing the narrative here, right? And behaviorally, I keep doing things like this, even though it makes me nervous, because every time I do it, it gets a little bit better. So that's kind of, if we're looking at a cognitive behavioral approach, how we attack it on both the cognitive level of how we're thinking the stories, but also behaviorally, like what we're doing, um, and how we can find a better path forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I appreciate that explanation. Um, I remember as I was researching what you do, I saw that you offer exposure and response prevention with OCD, to help your clients get control over intrusive thoughts, worries, decrease unhelpful coping, and learn to cope with uncertainty. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. Like, can you unpack all of that and kind of explain like how you do that and what that is?
Sure, absolutely. And exposure and response prevention, I'm just going to call it ERP because it's kind of a mouthful. It's a subset of cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's a type of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it really is emphasizes the behavioral piece. And what we look at is, when it comes to like OCD or fears and phobias, is that, again, the natural response for everybody, for most people, when they're scared, is to avoid, to just not do it. If I'm scared of flying, I'm just not going to go on a flight. If I'm scared of public speaking, I'm just not going to do it. So I keep avoiding, distracting myself, trying to find other ways to cope. Sometimes people do compulsions, and I'll get into that later. Um, so exposure and response prevention is about it, the way out is through. The way out of your fears is by confronting them face on. And so the exposure piece is, all right, if you're scared of public speaking, do more of it. Even, and yes, it's going to cause your anxiety to go up. It will. But maybe the first time you do it, your anxiety is at a 9 out of 10. And maybe the next time you do it is at an 8. And then the next time is at a 7. And that's what we see is called habituation. That over time, these fears weaken, and your brain starts to develop new neural pathways that are telling you this isn't as much of a threat as I thought it was. So you're able to start to think about things a little bit differently. It doesn't seem as scary as it used to the more you confront it. Um, so the response prevention piece now is, yes, expose yourself to your fears, but also be mindful of what you're doing while you're doing that. So I'll give an example, like fear of flying. If your exposure is you're scared of flying, so you go on a plane ride, it's not just hopping on that plane ride, right? Because if you are having a couple drinks before you're going on that plane ride because you're so nervous, or you're like the whole time you're like gripping your seat and you're like looking out for danger, and like, then is your brain able to really say this isn't a threat? Not really, right? So you keep yourself stuck by doing these, what we call safety behaviors. So every time you go on a flight, now you're going to need a drink, or you need your Xanax, or if you're kind of gripping your seat, your brain is like, this is a threat, right? So exposure and response prevention is exposing yourself to that fear, but also doing the best you can to sit in the discomfort, embrace it, accept it, without trying to find ways to make it better in momentarily. You following with me, or you have any questions
Yes,
about that?
100%. It made me think of like the videos we see of like the little kids who are getting their ear pierced, and as they go to do it, they tense up and they're scared, and then they're like, "Oh, that didn't hurt at all." You
Mm-hmm.
know, so the example you gave of flying, if you aren't allowing yourself to actually experience it to see what it is instead of what it isn't, you would stay stuck there. You would need to take the pills. You need to have a drink. But if you actually do it and experience it, you can, create that new pathway in your brain that would allow you to say, "Oh, I thought it was a threat, but I experienced it, and it's not." If
Mm-hmm.
if I'm following you properly.
Yes, absolutely. It's like, oh, this
Okay.
wasn't that bad, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I like that example that you gave too, because a lot of times when I do exposure therapy with people, especially if it's stuff like that that's really scary or gross, they like start to clench up. We all do it, right? Like, oh, imagine like I'm scared of spiders. When I see a spider, I just automatically tense, right? And so a lot of what I do is like, let's relax the body. Let's pretend you're not scared, even if you are, so that we can get that brain to start to update its way of thinking about this threat.
Oh, okay. So OCD, right? A lot of us think that it's hand washing 30 times or being afraid of germs. I don't think that we really understand what OCD truly is. So if you could you define it?
Yes, absolutely. So it's in the name. It's obsessions and compulsions. For in the diagnostic criteria is for at least an hour a day. So if you're engaging in obsessions or compulsions in at least an hour a day, and let me unpack what each one of those means. So when we're talking about obsessions, I think sometimes we can say like, oh, I'm so obsessed with blah blah blah, but we're really talking about something that is disturbing. It's not something that you're obsessed with that you like. If you're obsessed with, I don't know, with who's a Justin Bieber, is that a thing anymore? I don't know. People who are people obsessed with now? I don't know, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that is threatening to you, something that you can't stop thinking about because it's a fear. It's a threat to you, and you try to maybe think about other things, but your mind keeps going back to it, or maybe you're having intrusive thoughts, which I'll explain in a little bit. So the obsession piece is like, I can't stop thinking about this thing and I keep going over it and over it and over it mentally. Whereas the compulsions is again that behavior. Like compulsions are usually done for a couple different purposes. They're either to alleviate your discomfort or to prevent something bad from happening. So if I'm scared of, let's see, um, we talked about yeah, so for instance, with the hand washing, that's the most clear way that we think of OCD, right? If you're scared that you're going to get contaminated, you're going to wash your hands in order to prevent something bad from happening. And or if you're I mentioned it's either to prevent something bad from happening or to relieve the discomfort. So let's say I'm really worried about something that's coming up and I keep asking you over and over again, like, you don't think something bad is going to happen, right? You think I'm
Mm.
okay? And I keep asking you for reassurance. That's also kind of a compulsive behavior because I'm just trying to make myself feel better momentarily. And so when we're looking at OCD, there's this cycle that's happening where it's like you're scared of something. There's that obsession, like that mental obsession. It causes you discomfort. And then you're doing this behavior to alleviate the discomfort. And it works for the most part. It works, and that's why you keep doing it. But it works temporarily. But it has a long term cost. It keeps you stuck in this little spiral, right? So I get this momentary relief when I wash my hands. I feel better, but I'm still stuck on the germs and on the contamination. So That's why exposure and response prevention could be so helpful, because it kind of, instead of it breaks the cycle. Like, let's stop engaging in that safety behavior. Let's just tackle the fear and let all your alarms will go off, and then they start to slow down. They start to, your brain starts to realize, okay, I'm still alive, everything's okay. Okay, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But with OCD, it really in that cycle, where it gets stuck in that cycle of obsessions and compulsions.
Hmm. Almost like a hamster wheel is what I think of when you give that example, because like you said, you have the temporary relief. Like if you wash your hands, okay, I don't have germs, but the underlying fear is always there. So just because you wash your hands doesn't mean that you actually have relief. It just maybe means that you have relief in that moment, but it's going to circle right back around.
Exactly, exactly. And so we do that, even out people without OCD will do that, right? We get a momentary relief of some sort, but it doesn't really get rid of the fear underneath it.
Can OCD be effectively treated?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of treatments for it. I know ERP is the first line of treatment, so it's the but we it's highly very very effective. The only thing about ERP is that it does require a high level of insight and motivation, because it's really a lot of work to confront your fears. So you have to be ready for that, and people might not be there. So there's other approaches to, like, acceptance and commitment therapy, for instance, is another approach for, or now they have inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy. There's different approaches. This is not just ERP, but if you have the insight and the motivation, ERP can be really, really effective, and it can work pretty quickly. And I will say, though, that the research shows that a combination of medication and therapy is the most effective in getting people to improve their OCD symptoms. But I've seen
Hmm.
many, many people overcome it, feel better. So I believe I do it because I believe in the work. I see it help people.
Nice. Would you say that OCD is really maybe just a fear of fear? Because I mean, it sounds like fear is what is the underlying thing, and when I really think deep about it, like it's just you're afraid, is what I think, and I guess you'd have to deal with the fear to stop the cycle, and that's what the exposure to the fear is trying to treat or help with.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it is hugely fear based, and so, yeah, it is about kind of starting to find different ways to handle our fear. And sometimes it's not the most intuitive way. The intuitive way to handle our fear is to avoid, to run away.
Mm,
Um, and this is just finding a different path so that you don't have to be scared about those things anymore. Um, and
gotcha.
and also we'll mention that, like, OCD looks very different. I think we have this idea that it's like, germs and hand washing, and or like having your place perfect, orderly, and those are like two common ways that OCD presents themselves. So I'm not saying that that's not it. It is it, but a lot of people don't know is that it can come in all these different ways that, and for instance, a big piece of it can be harm, fear harm. Like, if a person with OCD might worry that they're gonna hurt themselves or gonna hurt somebody else, and they might think, like, I don't want to hurt myself. I don't want, but what if I act on impulse and I can't control it, and I have this urge to do it? So, for instance, like, have you ever, I know that, like, a common intrusive thought that people have, whether they have OCD or not, is like you're driving on the car, maybe you're in, like, alongside a cliff, and you have the intrusive thought of just, like, you know, uh, kind of turning your steering wheel and going in over the cliff, right? Like, that is like a common intrusive thought that, people have intrusive thoughts. But a person with OCD might get stuck on that. They might be like, what does that mean? Do I really want to hurt myself? Do I want to hurt my family? Like, and then they get, like, in this obsessive spiral over an intrusive thought. Um, so a lot of what we're doing with OCD is not only confronting fears, but it's also realizing like thoughts are just thoughts, and we have some weird thoughts sometimes. Like we all do. Like 90% of the population has intrusive thoughts about weird stuff, And I can give you examples if you want them, but it's normal to have weird thoughts. They don't need to mean more than just the weird thoughts. And most of the time, people without OCD, they get a weird thought and they're like, okay, that what? And then they just move on. That was weird. Okay. But a person with OCD might get stuck on the meaning and why am I having this thought and what does this mean about me? And then we get stuck in that spiral of like, how do I get rid of this thought and how do I feel better? And then it becomes more than just a thought. It starts to overcome. It starts to take over.
It it's the ruminating on the thought, right? Because I get weird thoughts all the time, and I'll just be like, "What the heck was that?" Right? But it comes and it goes,
Yeah.
and I think
Mm-hmm.
with OCD, like the thought comes, and then there's a roadblock, and it can't get out. Whereas people
Mm-hmm.
who don't have the obsession or the compulsion, the thought will come, you'll shake it off, and then just keep it moving.
Exactly. Yeah. We just see it as thought. So a big piece of like OCD is an overimportance of thoughts.
Mm,
Um, so thought isn't just a thought. It's like it means something about me. Um, and,
I
and
gotcha.
so it can't just be this like weird thought that I just take away. I want to bring more attention to it.
I see.
Mm.
I've
And so I
heard.
then like in that,
No. Go ahead. Please, what are you gonna say?
and I was just gonna say an example like that I see sometimes with people with OCD, but also in the general population is like medical concerns. For
Mm,
instance, like an obsessive thought that you might have cancer, you might have some kind of medical condition, and sometimes with like an example of that OCD spiral is instead of being like, okay, that was weird, or a thought that just the thought that came up, you start to analyze it. You start like, well, what if I do? And let me start WebMDing. And then when you WebMD, it tells you you're about to die. And then you're like, oh crap. And then you start asking your friends, like, you don't think I have cancer, do you? And then it starts to becoming this, it starts to expand bigger and
mm.
bigger, where it could have just been a thought of like, what if? And you just move on. It now becomes this a very real threat.
I see. I've heard intrusive thoughts referred to as a bad movie that keeps playing on a loop, and it is created in someone's mind who has OCD. So we kind of touched on it a little bit, but what are like the definition of intrusive thoughts?
So intrusive thoughts are thoughts that are disturbing, that come into your mind without you wanting them to. Sometimes I will say intrusive thoughts can come in the sense of urges too, which can be really scary for people. So how I had given you that example of like you're driving and you might have an urge to to move your steering wheel into oncoming traffic or for something for a reason. So it's not just thoughts. Sometimes it can be urges, and they're unwanted. They cause a lot of distress, but they're also automatic. There's not, you can't control them. And a lot of time people spend a lot of effort trying to control thoughts. And the more you try to control it, the worse they get. And that's the tough part. Like if I tell you to don't think of a pink elephant, you're going to be thinking of a pink elephant. So a lot of, again, what we try to do intuitively is to block, avoid, but then that feeds to the cycle. And intrusive thoughts are super normal. Like I said, like 80 to 90% of the population have them. So we have weird, disturbing thoughts. Um, but most of us are able to kind of move past them pretty quickly for the most part. We all get stuck from time to time. But a person with OCD, their brain structure is a little bit different, where they have a little bit more stickiness and they get stuck a lot. And they see these thoughts as huge threats, which of course brings the whole body into system. Your body's trying to protect you, your mind is trying to protect you, so you're going to engage in all these behaviors to try to feel safe again,
Hmm.
even if it keeps you stuck.
We mentioned like don't think about this. It's the moment someone says that, it's automatic that you're gonna think about it, right? So when you have clients that are stuck, like you said, they have the sticky thoughts. What does it mean, like, to challenge their thinking?
It can look a few different ways. So some ways of challenging our thinking can be like, do you really believe that? You know, you analyze the thought, like, is that, how true do you really think that is? How likely do you think that is to happen? Um, and so sometimes that can help. You know, so for instance, if you're worried that you're gonna die in a plane crash, I might ask you, how likely is that to actually happen? I mean, there's planes flying around all the time. And I might even make you realize that driving a car is more dangerous than being in a plane. So, so that would be an example of challenging the thinking. Sometimes that doesn't work, and people still like, okay, yes, there's a 0.001% chance, but it's still a chance, and I still don't want to take that chance. So sometimes challenging thoughts is more about just kind of being with them. Okay, like, so let's go with the what if. So what would happen? What would be the worst case scenario? And what would you do? And how would you cope with that? And what control do you really have of that happening? So it can also take that route. And that could be a little bit more helpful. So when people have a hard time challenge, if what I always tell people, especially with OCD, but in general, like, really be mindful if you're challenging your thoughts and you're just going back and forth within yourself. That's not helpful either. If you're like, oh no, no, that would never happen. Oh no, yes it would. And you're just like in this tug of war mentally, then you're also stuck, right? So then you have to find a different path forward. Sometimes challenging your thoughts and rationalizing can be really, really helpful, and sometimes it isn't. So you got to find a different way. And sometimes it's sitting with the discomfort. Sometimes it's like, all right, what is the worst case scenario? And what does that mean? And let me sit in all the feelings that come up for me when I think about this fear.
Okay, so when they have when you encourage your clients to sit in their feelings and the discomfort, that can be difficult. Now, I know that yoga is something that helps to bring you back into your body and to release trapped energy. So, the type of yoga that you do is trauma informed yoga. What is that?
So trauma. Okay, so I'm glad that you mentioned this. I just want to kind of start off by saying that yoga is that connection. It means union, right, between mind,
Mm.
body, spirit. Unfortunately, yoga has been like large, especially in the U.S., has been largely whitewashed and commercialized. So um, when you go to your doctor might be like, okay, you have stress, go to a yoga class, and then you show up and they're doing like acrobatics, and they're like, you're like, what is this? And they're like, go harder, and this is like mentality of just like perfection, right? So
Mm.
trauma informed yoga is really about trying to untangle that and trying to really be mindful of the language that we're using, and the fact that if you're going to yoga class, if you're doing yoga, it's because you want to have a different relationship with yourself, with your body, and you want to learn to kind of untangle your mind and find peace. And in order to do that, you need to be in control. And so trauma informed yoga is about choices. I will never tell you to do something, oh, do this pose. No, I'm saying, if you want to, you can do it this way. If you don't, you don't have to. You don't have to do it at all if you don't want to. And it's really about thinking about how oftentimes when people have experienced trauma, they have their freedom and choice has been taken from them. So if you have a person who's traumatized who comes to a yoga class and they see perfection and everyone doing these poses so perfectly, that's what they think they're going to do, even if it hurts their body, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if they're mentally and physically uncomfortable. And so trauma informed yoga is about giving you back a sense of agency and making choices that feel right for you, and also tuning into the mind and to the body. But again, it's really about giving yourself a sense of control, agency, autonomy, in your choices, and knowing that what feels good for me is going to might feel differently for you, and that's okay. And the important part is for you to do things that make you feel safe. So it's kind of keep getting all those concepts of yoga, but really being mindful of the language that we're using, and the choice making.
Well, I wouldn't have maybe thought of yoga as the way you described it, because, like you said, it's been commercialized. So, the first thing I think of when I think of yoga is like downward dog or something, but that is usually like, with a beach body workout or a warm up or something like that. So I don't think we really truly know what yoga is, just based on what we see on television and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. And I've seen, when I did my yoga teacher training, it wasn't a trauma informed yoga studio. I did that separately. Um, but I saw we all had like pain in our body. Like, some of the especially like, vinyasa is very cycle oriented. You're doing a lot of push ups and a lot of, the same movements over and over again. So a lot of us had joint pain. And to me, that's like a big, I always tell people when I'm doing yoga, like, if it feels uncomfortable, that's not, sometimes discomfort is important. We got to work through the
Mm.
tension. But if you're feeling pain, that's your body's signal that you need to back up, And so that's what I mean about how sometimes yoga can be like push you to do certain, if we're not being trauma informed, it can push you to really override your body's signs and do things
Mm.
that hurt you. And that's the exact opposite. Because if we're really being about mind, body, spirit, and connecting that, it's about like, okay, this doesn't feel good for me. I'm gonna back up a little bit. It's not about perfection. It's about being present and taking care of myself, right? So yeah, so it's a little bit about all of those concepts and trying to um, see the philosophy and the benefit of it rather than just perfection and the aloe yoga body thing. I could go on and on about that, but I won't.
Okay, I wanted to kind of come back a little bit to OCD, and one of the causes of OCD, or something associated with OCD, or just stress in general, and that is anxiety. And I wanted to know how big of a component is anxiety in OCD, or just flat out what is anxiety and how is it a contributing factor?
Sure. And anxiety, I want to start off by saying it's like a normal human emotion that we all feel, unless, again, like we said earlier, unless you're in your comfort zone and making no changes, then you might not ever feel it. But for the most part, it is a normal human emotion. And physiologically, like in your body, it's uncomfortable, it's discomfort, it feels like restlessness, and it feels like this nervous energy to do more, right? So physically, it can look a lot of different ways, but what I think of anxiety of is ultimately the fear of the future, and a lack of trust within yourself. So what I mean by fear of the future is that it, anxiety really has a hard time living in the now. It's all about what's going to happen in a few moments from now, tomorrow, and always expecting something bad to happen, right? And so, which has a caveat, I think there's why it's trauma and anxiety can go together too. Because if you're in a situation where either your ancestors or yourself have had a lot of bad things happening, it makes sense why you fear bad things happening. It's like, of course, that's what happens. It's always a struggle, right? So I do want to kind of make that connection of that anxiety can be really related to trauma in that way, and intergenerational trauma in particular. Um, but the other piece of my saying it's not just about worrying about the future. It's also about a lack of trust within yourself, because ultimately life, I mean, I wish it was all warm and fuzzies and great, but life is full of ups and downs. Stuff happens, things, bad things happen, whether we want to or not. It's part of life. It's part of the human experience. And so with anxiety, it's this lack of trust that you can do it, that you can cope. So it's like, oh yes, I'm always worried about this bad thing happening because I think it's gonna somehow like destroy me in a way, whereas what we try to do when we're trying to cope with anxiety is like, okay, maybe something bad does happen. I can't guarantee that it won't. And if I do, if I try to just reassure you nothing bad is going to happen, it's just going to go in one ear and out the other. It doesn't help. But it's like, okay, if the bad thing happened, eventually you'd be okay. You'd be able to learn to cope. Most of us move on, even with trauma. Most of us don't develop PTSD. Most of us struggle and then we get better and we move on. And so, yeah, so when I think of anxiety, it's that fear of the future, but also that lack of trust within yourself to handle things.
Um, you mentioned that trauma is something that is associated with anxiety, which makes sense, especially the more we learn about, the way trauma affects the brain. Um, One of your posts said, trauma isn't just bad things happening. What else can trauma be?
Yeah, so trauma is can also be a lack of good things happening. So
Mm,
if, for instance, you never got a lot of praise or affection or attention growing up, that we consider that maybe neglect. That is also traumatic because you might put yourself in situations, you might seek relationships that where somebody treats you like crap because you don't know what it's like to be loved, right? Or you might not be able to love yourself because you never know when it's been like to be loved by a caregiver or by somebody, right? So it's not just about bad things happening, it's also about a lack of good things happening in our lives, a lack of support, a lack of emotional attention, um, and so sometimes we have parents who will give us all the things in the world. Maybe they're not attending to our needs because they don't know how. So that could be also something that has an impact. And when I mean by trauma, I think sometimes we get really stuck on like the event. What is the trauma? What happened to you? And it's not about what happened to you. It's about how that situation impacted who you are, how you see the world, your body, your physiology, your psychology. So what for instance, like bullying. Somebody who has experienced one person who experienced bullying might be able to like okay move on and it doesn't really impact them. Another person it might completely change them. It might make them feel really unsafe in who they are. It might make them question themselves, and that might stay with them for the rest of their lives. So when we think about trauma, it's not the event or how big the event was, what happened. It's about it's almost like the imprint it has, the the effect it has on your life and who you are.
mm. That was a great explanation, and I heard it referred to recently as um, what happens inside of you, not what happened to you, but what happens inside of you. And I think when you look at it from that
Exactly.
perspective, it's so much broader. Because, like you said, someone can be bullied, and it could affect them for the rest of their life, whereas someone else may have just, I'm not worrying about those kids or whatever. So, and it also isn't about how it's looked at um, based on how everyone sees it, but it could just be one single person and how it affected them. So, I think we try to look at it with a broad lens, or just say, well, if it didn't affect this person, it shouldn't affect you this way. But it's all individual.
Exactly. Yeah, you could have, we have situations like, for instance, the pandemic. I think that's a trauma, right? We all went through it, and we all have been impacted by it differently. And there's
Yeah.
not a right wrong way, there's not a healthy and unhealthy, like it's just we're all different, and some of us it might stick with us a little bit longer than others.
Right. That's true because I mean I know some people were thrilled to be able to stay indoors and not have to deal with people, and and other people, they were really, really, really suffering. So it all trauma impacts us all differently. So I'm glad you said that so that we can know, don't worry about how it affected someone else. If it affected you, it affected you in the story.
Right, exactly, and it's okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's another thing. It's okay. because that's not
Mhm.
something we hear often. But for someone to say to you, okay, the way you're feeling about what happened to you is okay. I
Yeah.
remember the first time I heard that, I was just like, really?
What do you
Because
mean?
of
Right.
expectation. Yeah. It's the expectation of how it's supposed to be based on what society says or what, your caregiver said or what your family has said for generations. But hearing that it was okay was a big deal.
Right. Yeah. Something so simple can, you know, impact so much for us that we're all different, and it's okay to feel how we feel. And I think the problem lies is when we feel like it's not okay and we try to convince ourselves that we're not affected or that we're fine when we're not. I think that's when we get ourselves into a little bit of a pickle.
Hmm. Okay, the next question I want to ask is, what is compassion fatigue?
Yes. So compassion fatigue, you see this a lot with people who are like healthcare workers in the helping profession, but or a caregiver, but we all can experience it. And basically, I'll start off by saying, what is compassion, right? When compassion is the sensation that we have when we see somebody suffering and we want to do something to try to help. So if I see somebody, you know, unhoused person who looks like, they're struggling, I might have feelings of feeling distraught because I want to help them in some way, right? So that is a very normal and healthy emotion to feel compassion. Compassion fatigue happens and often when we have repeated situations in which we want to help but we can't, or the way we can help is only going to do so much. And so this is why a lot of caregivers and healthcare workers can experience this, because you're dealing with suffering all the time and you feel like I can't do anything to alleviate this person's suffering, and so that block where we want to help but we can't, it 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 starts to wear at our it chip away at us, and it can make us feel like very disconnected, like that might make us like not feel anything, numb, or it might make us kind of get into these like unhealthy patterns of doing too much or overextending ourselves to the point where it's harming ourselves. So it can look a lot of different ways. It can mimic burnout in some ways, um, in terms of the impact, but it is kind of based off of this idea that I want to help, I have these warm feelings of compassion and desire to help others, but I feel like I can't. Like there's too much suffering, there's not enough. And so I think as a society, I think a lot of us might be feeling it too, because there seems to be so much suffering in the world and we feel helpless, right? Like I'm just one person, what am I going to do? And so I think like we might experience it individually, but I think as a whole, we're all experiencing it as a society because we don't feel like we have a lot of power to improve things around us.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's a little bit of what compassion fatigue is.
Which could lead to anxiety
Yeah,
and
can lead to
then
stress,
intrusive
anxiety,
thoughts
burnout.
and take us right back and keep us on that hamster wheel. That was why I wanted to ask that question, to try and tie that back into how it can make us feel. Because if you're pouring from an empty cup, but you have a big heart, you may start to question yourself,
Mhm.
and then once you start to question yourself, you're going to have stress and anxiety, and then you may start to have bad thoughts about what you could have done or what you should have done, or I'm a bad person, and that could get
Yeah.
stuck and lead right to those
Yeah.
obsessions and compulsions.
Yes, absolutely. So you're right on the nose on that. Of it leads to negative thoughts about ourselves a lot of times. Of like I'm not doing enough. What's wrong with me? Things like that. And I love I'm pouring from an empty cup analogy because I think the number one way that you can work on compassion fatigue is by bringing some of that compassion towards yourself, by filling your own cup, if you will. Like yes, you want to help everybody else, but it's kind of that, like you got to put your own oxygen mask first, and you had to bring in some of that love, that comfort that you want to give others, and you got to learn to give it to yourself. And for a lot of us, especially like therapists and people that are healers, um, we're so used to giving that idea of kind of like giving it to ourselves. It can be more challenging than you might think. So, so yeah, but if we can learn to give a little bit of that energy back towards us, it can go a long way in terms of that compassion fatigue.
Thanks. Um, okay, how can the question, what if, keep us stuck in a cycle of trying to find certainty and make us sick with worry?
Oh yes, the what if, the dreaded what if. I think we all are guilty of this, right? What if something bad happens? What if I, fill in the blank? We can. This is a part of our vocabulary, um, and really, what happens with what if is what I mentioned about anxiety. It's in the future. It's never in the now, right? It's what if something happens bad in the future. So, and there could be a million different what ifs. I could come up with 100 different scenarios of bad things happening. And what I always think about is like, even if the bad thing does happen, you kind of lived it twice. You lived it in your mind first, and then you lived it in reality, right? So I think it's like double suffering in a way. And the thing is too that sometimes it doesn't even happen. So then you just made yourself sick for no reason. And even if it does happen again, how does worrying help you? How does it make it prevent it bad from happening? It doesn't help you. It just makes you sick with worry.
Hmm.
So yeah, we can get stuck on all these bad things potentially happening, and it robs us from like the ability to enjoy the present moment, and and keeps us in the future, which again is where anxiety lies. It always is in the
Hmm.
future.
Very true.
One little way
Okay,
that I
so
help people like untangle that. Oh, sorry.
no, no,
And
no.
I was
Go ahead,
just
go ahead.
gonna say that one way to untangle that is to just come back to what is. So what
Hmm.
is happening now? So instead of what if, well, what if I get a bad grade, or what if I lose my job? You're like, what is happening right now? I have a job. I'm here. I'm healthy. I'm doing okay. And just kind of coming back to the present moment and appreciating it if you can.
What is instead of what if? I like that. I like that. I'm stealing that one.
Yeah. Go for it. Steal away.
Okay, so if you could use your platform and your experience and knowledge as a therapist to help someone who's struggling with anxiety, intrusive thoughts, worry, um, OCD, all the things, the compulsions, what would you say?
I would say that anxiety is part of the human experience. It's normal to feel it. It's okay. And the more you fight it, the harder it becomes. The more you avoid, the harder it becomes. And there are tools that you can implement to untangle this. And there's freedom. It's not easy. It takes some time, and sometimes we have to learn a new way of being. But there is freedom that's available, that we can untangle this and we can learn to feel calmer and more secure. And I don't use the word like joy or happiness often in my work. Like I don't say, my goal isn't to help people find joy necessarily. Some people do that, and that's great for them. But I'm more about peace, because joy, happiness, these are also temporary emotions, right? It's like the pendulum swings one way and they're the other. So I'm more concerned about peace and just finding like calm in your mind. And
Hmm.
I think it is possible. You might not know the way, but there's plenty of tools, and it's just about slowly rewiring our brain and restructuring our beliefs and finding different ways to behave.
Nice. That was great advice. I think we did good, and I think we were nervous for nothing.
See, you could have said all the what ifs. But,
I want to say
yeah,
thank you so much
thank
for
you.
doing this with me, and for who you are and what you do and your knowledge. If people wanted to find you online or social media, where can they find you?
Sure, it's at Karla Sanchez, LCSW. My website's under construction. Well, it's going to be changing, but right now it's anxiety-therapist.com. Um, so that's where you can find me. But thank you so much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope it was useful.
Likewise, I think it was great. And if we got one person who watches this and benefits from it, we did our job.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you, Karla.